The electricity industry today is at a watershed. It's going through a paradigm shift, the likes of which I don't believe it's seen since the very first electrical distribution system was established in the northeast of the United States 100 years ago. The essence of this shift is from a linear, one-way orientation, a producer delivering to a set of passive consumers, to an organic relationship where the consumer and the supplier are entwined in a much more organismic relationship. What's happened in the last 10 years is an awareness emergent around the greenhouse gas production and the environmental impact of producing electricity, an awareness around our reliance on it from a security point of view, and an awareness of the cost, which until relatively recently hasn't featured very strongly. That's partially been because governments have set tariffs which haven't been particularly reflective of costs, and in fact over the last 15 years or so there's often been an artificial suppression of tariffs so that people haven't had an actual sense of the cost of electricity. In my view, there's been almost 2 generations now who've grown to expect electricity as a kind of birthright without any sense of what's involved in providing access to it or without any sense of the cost of it. We're now at a point, thanks to a number of factors, where that is changing. What I believe is needed is a recognition by everybody that we are entering a new paradigm, one in which the consumer plays a much larger role than historically. That's partly driven by the appetite of some consumers to have a bigger influence on where they get their electricity from. And it's partly driven by the interest in reducing the cost, which means that everybody needs to see clearly what the cost components are in a cost-reflective way. The organism effectively needs to take into account a tariff structure that accurately reflects the cost of electricity, and I'll talk about the subcomponents of that in a minute. It also needs to include hardware and software that make available to the consumer a clear picture of the cost of what they're consuming when they're consuming it. And it also relies on a selection of generation sources appropriately interconnected. And the diagram that you can see on the screen now actually represents that. You'll see around the outside you've got the elements of prosperity, security and sustainability, and interconnecting those you've got some sub-elements which talk about the right kind of tariff structures, the right kind of long-term infrastructure and the right kind of generation. And moving outwards from that you can see some sub-elements. I think of that energy management organism as exactly that, an organism, and all of those components need to interrelate in order to deliver what's required of the electricity industry today. There are in fact 2 value streams in the electricity industry, and this hasn't been recognised well in historic tariff structures, which have basically been a bundled tariff. Access to the network is a little bit like having access to railway lines if I am a train operator. I need the network to be able to transact with my energy. So the amount of network that I need access to is determined by the maximum amount of electricity that I'll want to inject or extract. For most domestic users, that'll be the maximum amount that I want to take out. Now, the maximum amount that I need requires a fixed amount of infrastructure to support that. So we can work out my little component of the transmission lines, distribution lines, transformers and my own run out that actually contribute to my being able to participate in the energy market, if you like. That's a fixed charge because there's a fixed investment. Separately to that, there is a separate value stream, which is the energy value stream. So if I'm a generator or retailer, it's the value of the energy that I produce that you then consume. If you are a solar panel operator, it's the amount that I'm injecting back into the system, or the difference that I'm extracting from the network, which has been reduced by the amount I've produced myself. But that variable component of energy is quite a separate value stream from the value of connectivity. The next piece of cost reflectivity goes to what kind of generation am I using to support my consumption. So if I'm consuming from a coal-fired power station, there will be a value of that energy which ought to include a cost of carbon as a subcomponent, and then there'll be some cost of the process of generating and retailing. If I'm drawing from a solar panel, well, I'll have paid for that, and I'll simply be paying a much smaller component for the differential in energy that I'm taking from the system. The other thing to consider is that that variable component has a value that varies with the time of day and the time of year. So on a very hot summer's day at the peak, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the value of the energy that I'm taking is very much higher because of the plant that's running in order to produce it, peaking plant, as opposed to the cost of energy that I'm drawing at 2 o'clock in the morning when baseload plant is generating, and that's considerably cheaper. So I need a cost structure that shows me that cost that varies with the time of day and with the time of year. Without infrastructure which gives information to the consumer on a moment-by-moment basis, they're not fully apprised of the impact of their consumption patterns. So we need a smart metering network that not only provides smart connectivity, but also information to the consumer on a moment-by-moment basis. In other words, if they're consuming a very large amount at peak times, they would be getting a signal that says this is extremely expensive, and that would tend to drive them out of the peak in terms of their consumption behaviour. If this works, then what needs to be built in terms of firm infrastructure is less over time, because the behaviour of the consumer, driven by the cost, reduces the peak consumption. If all of those components are in place, back to that diagram, you can see that the overall organism will be enabled to move towards the most optimally costed electricity framework. It's one that will allow people, for example, to draw energy from solar panels or from microgeneration. This is relevant in a city and also at the edges of the grid. It may become more effective for people to do that than to connect. But most people will want to connect, but have a choice of whether they're drawing from the grid or injecting back into it from solar cells. A smart network which actually manages that two-way flow and reflects the cost is what is necessary to support that paradigm shift. If cost reflectivity extends then into the generation world, so that generation is costed not only for the energy but the carbon impact in some way, that will mean that renewable sources are better represented in the energy mix because they'll obviously have a carbon benefit. This will mean that the overall organism over time should see us moving to an optimal mix of generation, an appropriately built and refurbished network, and customer opportunities and behaviours that produce energy consumption at the optimal cost over time. It's a significant movement from the fairly static arrangement that we currently have, and one of the big investments needed will be smart metering on a large enough scale to actually have that accumulated impact. This will require a significant upfront investment that will need to be recovered over several years, and this is a substantial challenge to energy consumers who have been getting energy or electricity at a rate significantly lower than its actual cost for many years. So we need to find a way of transitioning rapidly and fairly to this new paradigm. But what I hope I've covered in that picture is a bit of a grasp of the elements that need to be part of the new paradigm and how they need to interact. The one thing I would emphasise is this paradigm shift is inescapable. It's coming, and it needs to be embraced by everyone. Consumers, producers, transporters, and governments and regulators, because painful as it may be to make the transition to a cost-reflective electrical world, it is overdue, and if we don't, it won't support the right kind of decisions, both in terms of how consumers behave, but also ultimately in terms of the right kinds of generation, including renewables, being connected to the system in the way that they need to be. And this will come about if we are actually able to embrace true cost reflectivity.